The story of Julius Caesar begins not on the battlefield or in the Senate, but in the quiet shadows of Rome's old nobility, where names carried the weight of history and ambition was carved into the bones of its citizens. Born in the year 100 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar came into a city caught between the ideals of its ancient republic and the ambitions of men who sought to bend that system to their will. His family, though of patrician descent, had long since lost its wealth and power. They carried the prestige of ancestry, but little of the influence that defined Rome's ruling class. It was in this delicate balance of noble blood and diminished fortune that Caesar was raised, shaped by the hunger to restore what his lineage once commanded, and perhaps even reach beyond it. From a young age, Caesar understood the fragility of power in Rome. Civil unrest plagued the city as old. Rivalries between the Senate's conservative elites and reformers loyal to the people spiraled into open violence. It was during this turbulent era that Caesar's uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, rose as a champion of the populares, advocating for the rights of common citizens and clashing bitterly with the Senate's defenders. Through Marius, Caesar witnessed firsthand how loyalty to the people could elevate a man to power, but also how swiftly fortune could turn. When Marius fell from grace, the Senate's enforcer, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, seized control of Rome in a bloody purge, and Caesar found himself suddenly branded an enemy by association. Sulla ordered him to renounce his marriage to Cornelia, Marius's daughter, as a test of loyalty. Caesar refused. It was a decision that nearly cost him his life, but also one that revealed his defining trait, an unyielding refusal to submit, even when obedience promised safety. Stripped of his inheritance, hunted by Sulla's men, and forced into hiding, Caesar narrowly escaped death, saved only by the intercession of friends who pleaded for his pardon. Sulla, reluctantly granting clemency, is said to have remarked, "There are many Mariuses in Caesar." It was a prophecy of the storm the young man would one day bring upon Rome itself. Exile, however, became his education. Caesar joined the military, serving first in Asia Minor, where he quickly distinguished himself in combat. His bravery under fire was more than youthful eagerness. It was calculated, a performance meant to cement his reputation among soldiers and commanders alike. In one notable instance, during the siege of Mytilene, Caesar rescued a fellow soldier in the thick of battle, earning himself the civic crown of oak leaves, one of Rome's highest honors for valor. Such recognition elevated his name, marking him not as a forgotten outcast of Sulla's purge, but as a rising figure whose courage demanded notice. Fate, however, seemed determined to test him further. On his voyage across the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by pirates mercenaries who infested the waters and made their living through ransom. They demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, but Caesar, with the arrogance of one who already believed himself destined for greatness, laughed and insisted they ask for 50 instead. For weeks, he lived among them, not as a prisoner trembling for freedom, but as a guest who mocked their ignorance, recited poetry, and promised that once freed, he would return to crucify them all. The pirates, amused by his confidence, released him once the ransom was paid, only to discover that Caesar was no idle boaster. He swiftly raised a fleet, hunted them down, and made good on his word, crucifying the lot of them, but in a twist of calculated mercy, ordering their throats cut beforehand so they would suffer less. It was the first glimpse of the paradox that would define him. Ruthless yet pragmatic, merciless yet strangely compassionate. With Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome, now free of his old enemy's shadow. But the city he entered was a place of corruption and rivalry, where politics was war, fought with words and gold rather than swords. Caesar honed his skills as an orator, studying under some of the greatest rhetoricians of his age. His voice, sharp and commanding, soon echoed through the forum as he prosecuted corrupt governors, using his speeches to align himself with the cause of justice while subtly weaving his own ambitions into the fabric of public opinion. His words carried not only the weight of logic, but the force of charisma. Rome's citizens listened, and more importantly, they remembered. It was not enough to merely speak. Caesar understood that in Rome, spectacle mattered as much as policy. He threw lavish games and public entertainments, spending money he did not have, plunging himself deep into debt to secure the favor of the masses. His opponents mocked him as a reckless spendthrift, but the people adored him. To them, Caesar was not merely another ambitious senator. He was a man who gave them bread, who entertained them with grand displays, who made them feel seen in a city that often forgot its poor. Behind the debts stood a network of creditors who, knowingly or not, were financing the rise of one of history's greatest leaders. His marriage to Pompeia, a granddaughter of Sulla, further cemented his position among Rome's nobility, though it was a union more political than affectionate. His true loyalties remained with the populares, aligning him with figures like Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, whose immense fortune could sustain Caesar's political career. It was through such alliances that Caesar began to weave the intricate web of influence that would one day strangle the old republic. Yet even as he climbed Rome's political ladder, whispers followed him, of ambition too naked, of debts too great, of a man who sought not merely power but a crown. It was in his campaign for the position of Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, that Caesar's daring reached new heights. Traditionally, the role was reserved for elder statesmen of unquestionable dignity. Caesar, young and burdened by debt, seemed an unlikely candidate. Yet through tireless campaigning and promises made in every corner of the city, he secured victory. On the morning of the election, he is said to have told his mother, "Today, you will see your son as Pontifex Maximus or as an exile." Such was the gamble of his life. All or nothing. Risk everything for the chance at greatness. But it was war, not politics, that would truly shape him. Assigned the governorship of Hispania Ulterior, Caesar found himself burdened by debt, yet commanding a province rich with opportunity. There, he led his legions against rebellious tribes, showing both brilliance in strategy and an ability to inspire loyalty among his men. His victories brought not only glory, but also wealth, allowing him to pay down his crushing debts. Standing before a statue of Alexander the Great in Spain, Caesar is said to have wept, lamenting that by the same age, Alexander had conquered the known world, while he had achieved so little. Yet this moment of despair was also a spark, a reminder that destiny had not placed him on earth to be ordinary. He would not rest until his name rivaled the greatest in history. When his governorship ended, Caesar returned to Rome, his ambition burning brighter than ever. There, he orchestrated one of the most famous political alliances in history, the First Triumvirate, a pact with Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Crassus, its wealthiest citizen. Together, they formed a triangle of power that bent the Republic to their will, dominating the Senate and forcing through their agendas. For Caesar, it was the perfect stage backed by Pompey's legions and Crassus's gold. He would be propelled into the highest offices, paving the way for his most daring endeavor yet, the conquest of Gaul. By the time Caesar set out for Gaul in 58 BC, he was no longer the hunted youth of Sulla's purges, nor the indebted politician scrambling for survival. He was a man with the loyalty of soldiers, the adoration of the people, and the ambition to match the greatest conquerors of history. In the forests and rivers of Gaul, he would find both the crucible and the crown of his career, transforming himself from a Roman statesman into a legend whispered across the world. The Republic trembled, though it did not yet know it, for Caesar was coming, and with him came the storm. The conquest of Gaul remains one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history, not merely for its scale, but for how it elevated Caesar from a talented politician into a figure who commanded the loyalty of legions and the attention of the entire Roman world. When he first took command in 58 BCE, Gaul was a fractured region, a patchwork of tribes with shifting alliances, prone to internal conflict, and vulnerable to external pressure from migrating peoples. Caesar saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He was ambitious, deeply in debt, and keenly aware that military glory could secure his place among Rome's greatest. And so he began a campaign that would last nearly a decade, one that would test not only his brilliance as a strategist, but his ruthlessness as a leader. It began with the Helvetii, a tribe attempting to migrate westward through Roman territory. Caesar seized on their movement as justification to intervene. He mustered his legions, built defenses with astonishing speed, and inflicted a crushing defeat. But it was not enough to win a single victory. He knew narratives mattered, and so he penned dispatches back to Rome, his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written in simple, almost clinical Latin, portraying himself as a man acting in Rome's defense, never for personal ambition. These writings became propaganda masterpieces, ensuring that even as he spilled rivers of blood far from the Tiber, the citizens of Rome viewed him as their protector. Over the years that followed, Caesar expanded his control deeper into Gaul. He faced the Germanic king Ariovistus and defeated him, pushing Rome's influence across the Rhine. He conducted campaigns in Brittany, marched as far as the English Channel, and even launched expeditions into Britain itself, a land shrouded in mystery for the Romans. These ventures did not yield permanent conquest, but they bolstered his reputation as the first Roman general to cross into those distant lands. More importantly, they reminded his soldiers that under his command, no frontier was too remote, no sea too wide. He gave them victory after victory, riches plundered from defeated tribes, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Yet Gaul was not easily subdued. Its tribes were fierce, independent, and resistant to Roman domination. The greatest challenge came from Vercingetorix, the charismatic chieftain of the Arverni, who in 52 BCE united many Gallic tribes under the banner of rebellion. Vercingetorix understood something few others did, that defeating Rome on the battlefield was nearly impossible. But starving them of resources and dragging them into protracted conflict could wear them down. He burned his own villages, denied supplies, and sought to outlast the legions. At first, his strategy brought him victories, but Caesar was relentless. The two commanders eventually clashed at the fortress city of Alesia, where Caesar built vast fortifications walls to trap the defenders inside, and additional outer walls to repel reinforcements. It was a feat of engineering as much as military brilliance. The siege of Alesia became legendary. Waves of Gallic reinforcements assaulted the outer defenses, while Vercingetorix's men struck from within. For days, the battle raged on both sides of Caesar's walls. The Romans fought desperately, holding against superior numbers, sustained only by their discipline and their faith in Caesar's leadership. When the Gallic forces finally broke and scattered, Vercingetorix surrendered, riding out on his horse to lay down his arms before Caesar. Gaul was broken, though not pacified, and Caesar stood triumphant. His conquest added vast territories to Rome, enriched the state with plunder and slaves, and, more importantly, gave Caesar unmatched prestige and an army fiercely loyal to him personally. But while Caesar triumphed in Gaul, storm clouds gathered in Rome. His partnership with Pompey and Crassus had frayed. Crassus was killed during a disastrous campaign against the Parthians in the east. And Pompey, once Caesar's ally and even his son-in-law, shifted toward the Senate's conservative faction. The Senate grew increasingly wary of Caesar's power. They feared that once his governorship ended, he would be stripped of his legions and left vulnerable to prosecution for abuses of power. For Caesar, returning to Rome without his army meant ruin. He had to choose between yielding to the Senate or defying it. In 49 BCE, that choice came to a head. The Senate, under pressure from Pompey and his allies, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was, in effect, a demand for his political death. Caesar paused at the banks of the Rubicon River, the small but symbolically crucial boundary between his province and Italy proper. Crossing it with his army would be an act of treason, a declaration of civil war. Ancient writers tell us that as he stood there, weighing his fate, he uttered the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. With that, he led his men across the Rubicon, setting Rome on a path of blood and upheaval from which there would be no return. Panic swept Rome as news spread of Caesar's advance. Pompey and many senators fled south, abandoning the city rather than face him directly. Caesar moved swiftly, seizing Rome without resistance, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a man acting in defense of the Republic against corruption and tyranny. Yet the reality was undeniable. He was now at war with the very state he claimed to protect. Civil war engulfed the Roman world, dividing families, cities, and entire provinces as Caesar and Pompey prepared for a struggle that would decide the future of Rome. Caesar pursued Pompey across Italy and into Greece, where the decisive confrontation loomed. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two armies clashed in a battle that would reshape the Republic. Caesar's forces were outnumbered, but his mastery of tactics and the unwavering loyalty of his men carried the day. Pompey fled in defeat, seeking refuge in Egypt, but there he met a cruel fate, assassinated on the orders of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he wept. It was not only the end of a rival, but of a man who had once been his ally and friend. Caesar, however, did not leave Egypt immediately. Instead, he became entangled in the kingdom's own dynastic struggle, siding with Cleopatra VII, the ambitious young queen, against her brother Ptolemy. Their alliance was both political and personal, and it bound Caesar's name to Cleopatra's for all time. Together, they secured her throne, and from this union would come a son, Caesarion. But even as Caesar lingered in Egypt, the flames of civil war still smoldered across the Roman world. He would soon be drawn back into conflict, compelled to crush resistance in Africa, Spain, and beyond before he could secure his supremacy. By the time Caesar returned to Rome, he was no longer merely a general or a politician. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world, a victor of civil war, a conqueror of Gaul, and the arbiter of Egypt's throne. Yet his greatest challenge still lay ahead, not on the battlefield, but in the delicate balance between power and perception, between ambition and the fragile traditions of the Republic. For Caesar's meteoric rise had made him beloved by many, but deeply feared by others. And in Rome, fear could be just as deadly as any army. The Rome that Julius Caesar returned to after the bloody wars of the civil conflict was a city both exhausted and divided. The Senate was weakened, its authority frayed by years of violence, shifting allegiances, and the collapse of the old political order. Many aristocrats viewed Caesar as a tyrant in waiting, a man whose ambition knew no limits, while others saw in him a savior who could bring order to chaos. For the Roman people, weary of instability, famine, and uncertainty, Caesar's arrival was met with a strange mix of relief and unease. They wanted stability, but they also feared what price it might demand. Caesar, however, wasted little time. With Pompey gone and his enemies defeated, he began to reshape Rome in his own image. His reforms touched every aspect of society, politics, law, economics, even the calendar. He pardoned many of his former enemies, a move that shocked both allies and rivals alike. To some, this mercy looked like magnanimity, a gesture of confidence from a man who no longer needed to fear them. To others, it was a dangerous signal. Caesar intended not just to defeat opponents, but to make them powerless through dependency. One of his boldest reforms was aimed at addressing Rome's deep economic inequalities. Land redistribution had been a political firestorm for decades, but Caesar pushed forward. He resettled veterans who had followed him through years of campaigning, granting them farmland both in Italy and in distant provinces. He also sought to relieve debt, a problem that had fueled unrest among the lower classes. His measures weren't radical enough to satisfy everyone, but they were sweeping enough to unsettle the wealthy elite. To them, Caesar was tampering with the delicate balance of Roman society for his own gain. But perhaps his most lasting contribution was to the calendar. The old Roman system had drifted hopelessly out of alignment with the solar year, creating confusion in agriculture, festivals, and politics alike. Caesar, drawing on Egyptian astronomical knowledge, introduced the Julian calendar, a structure of 12 months and 365 days, with a leap year every fourth year. It was a remarkable reform, one that brought order to time itself, and it endured in Europe for over 1,600 years. Yet, even this practical act was laced with symbolism. It was as though Caesar was imposing his will not only on Rome, but on the very fabric of the universe. Despite his reforms, his growing concentration of power bred suspicion. Caesar was elected dictator not once, but multiple times, each term growing longer. By 46 BCE, he was appointed dictator for 10 years, and in 44 BCE, the Senate named him Dictator Perpetuo Dictator for life. This title, more than any other, sounded alarms in the hearts of those who still cherished the fading ideals of the Republic. Rome had always despised kingship, ever since the expulsion of its last monarch centuries earlier. To call a man dictator for life was to whisper the unthinkable. Rome once again had a king. As Caesar's power expanded, so too did his personal image. Statues of him were erected across Rome. His face appeared on coins, a privilege once reserved for gods. He dressed in purple robes, the color of royalty, and allowed honors to be heaped upon him in public ceremonies. Though he often declined the title of king when it was offered, his actions blurred the line between ruler and monarch. For his supporters, these displays were the natural acknowledgement of his greatness. For his enemies, they were proof that Caesar intended to strangle the Republic and replace it with his own dynasty. In the Senate and in whispered conversations on Rome streets, fear grew. Prominent senators, men like Brutus, Cassius, and Cato's old allies, watched with unease as Caesar consolidated power. They remembered how he had crossed the Rubicon, how he had crushed Pompey, how he had bent Rome to his will. They asked themselves, if he was allowed to continue unchecked, what would remain of the republic they had inherited? Would future generations know senators, assemblies, and civic freedoms, or only emperors? The tension grew thicker in early 44 BCE when Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, staged a dramatic moment during the festival of Lupercalia. Before the assembled crowd, Antony offered Caesar a crown, a clear symbol of kingship. The people gasped, the Senate bristled, and Caesar refused it, but not immediately. He pushed it aside with a performance that was equal parts humility and spectacle, showing the crowd that he would not be king, yet ensuring they never forgot the image of him with a crown in his grasp. To his critics, it was proof that he desired kingship, even if he dared not seize it openly. In private, Caesar's ambitions stretched further still. He was planning a massive campaign in the east, a conquest of Parthia that would rival Alexander the Great's legendary exploits. His dream was not only to avenge Rome's humiliating defeat at Carrhae decades earlier, but to push Roman dominion farther than it had ever reached. He envisioned himself not just as Rome's ruler, but as the architect of a new world order. His enemies in Rome, however, feared that if he left with such power, he might never return, or if he did, it would be as a godlike conqueror beyond all challenge. Thus, the conspiracy began to form. Senators who had once fought against him, and even those he had pardoned, began to meet in secret. Marcus Junius Brutus, a man of noble lineage who had been spared by Caesar, wrestled with his conscience. Gaius Cassius Longinus, bitter and resentful after years of Caesar's dominance, urged action. They gathered others men who spoke of liberty, of the Republic, of duty to Rome. Yet beneath their noble rhetoric lay another truth: fear. Fear that Caesar's shadow would grow so vast there would be no room left for them, or for the Republic itself. Caesar, for his part, seemed blind to the danger. He was surrounded by flatterers, generals, and loyalists who assured him of his greatness. Though he had been warned by soothsayers, by omens, even by his wife Calpurnia, he brushed aside the signs. "Beware the Ides of March," the soothsayer had said, but Caesar laughed at such warnings. He was a soldier, a conqueror, a man who had faced death countless times and triumphed. How could daggers in the shadows frighten him now, after all he had achieved? Yet in Rome, the stage was being set for betrayal. The Senate, the heart of the Republic, was about to become the place where its most famous son would fall. And as the Ides of March drew closer, Rome held its breath, caught between adoration and suspicion, loyalty and treachery, waiting for the moment when destiny would strike. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, began like any other in Rome. No whispers carried on the streets foretold unease. The soothsayer who had once warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March had not been forgotten. Yet Caesar himself, confident in his destiny, dismissed the words as superstition. Still, omens seemed to press upon him. His wife, Calpurnia, had dreamed of his statue spouting blood, with Romans washing their hands in it. She begged him not to attend the Senate that day, but Caesar, a man who had never been ruled by fear, felt the weight of appearances, pressing harder than the warnings of dreams. To cancel his attendance would be seen as weakness, and weakness was something his enemies would seize upon instantly. Against her pleas, he decided to go, believing fate was something no man could escape. As he walked through the streets toward the theater of Pompey, where the Senate session was held, the citizens cheered as usual. Some shouted words of loyalty, while others whispered prayers for his safety. Among the senators, however, a very different kind of anticipation hung in the air. Cassius, Brutus, Casca, Decimus, and over 60 others had prepared for this moment, convincing themselves that what they were about to do was not murder, but an act of liberation, a defense of the Republic against tyranny. Brutus, in particular, was tormented, torn between his personal affection for Caesar and his belief that Caesar's ambition would undo the Republic. For him, this day was a sacrifice of friendship in service to Rome. Inside the Senate chamber, Caesar was greeted with respect, as though nothing were amiss. The conspirators gathered closer, pretending to present petitions. At first, their words were steady, measured, carefully concealing their true purpose. But as they circled around him, the air thickened with tension, and Caesar, ever sharp, must have felt a shift he could not ignore. One senator moved forward, grabbing his toga as if in supplication. Then, in an instant, Casca struck the first blow, slashing at his neck. Shock rippled through the chamber as the others drew their daggers, driving them into Caesar from every side. The great general struggled to defend himself, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. Blow after blow fell upon him until the moment Brutus himself stepped forward. Legend says that Caesar, seeing the man he loved like a son, whispered the famous words, "Et tu, Brute?" Though historians debate whether those words were ever spoken. What is certain is that Caesar, recognizing the betrayal, ceased his struggle. With his last strength, he pulled his toga over his face and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, as though even in death, Rome's history was folding in on itself. When the deed was done, the conspirators stood together, their daggers dripping with blood. They expected cheers, a wave of gratitude from the Senate and the people for saving the Republic. Instead, silence and terror filled the chamber. Many senators had fled during the attack, and word of Caesar's assassination quickly spread through the city. But instead of relief, Rome was gripped by panic. Citizens locked their doors, fearing chaos, while others rushed into the streets, demanding to know what had happened. The conspirators tried to present themselves as liberators, parading through the forum with their bloody daggers held high. But the people of Rome, who had adored Caesar for his reforms and his generosity, did not hail them as heroes. To many, they had slain not a tyrant but a beloved leader. The streets echoed with confusion and grief, while the conspirators found themselves increasingly isolated. In the days that followed, Caesar's body was laid out for a public funeral. Mark Antony, who had served as Caesar's loyal ally, delivered a speech that would ignite the fury of the Roman people. His words, calculated yet dripping with emotion, painted Caesar not as a tyrant but as a benefactor, a man who had left gifts in his will for the citizens of Rome. He revealed Caesar's cloak, torn and bloodied from the assassination, showing where each dagger had pierced his flesh. The crowd, already restless, erupted in grief and rage. When Caesar's body was burned on a makeshift pyre, riots broke out, and the conspirators quickly realized they had miscalculated. Brutus and Cassius had believed they were saving the Republic, but Caesar's death instead plunged Rome into deeper turmoil. Antony, Octavian Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus soon formed the Second Triumvirate, vowing to avenge him. The conspirators, once celebrated senators, became fugitives, hunted across the provinces. Civil wars erupted once more, rivers of blood flowing across the lands of Rome, and in the end, it was not the Republic that was restored, but the foundations of empire that were laid even firmer. Caesar's name lived on, immortalized not just in statues and monuments, but in the very title of kingship itself. Caesar became synonymous with ruler, carried forward by emperors of Rome, and echoed in the words Kaiser and Tsar for centuries to come. The man who had risen from a patrician family, who had crossed the Rubicon, defied tradition, and carved his place in history, was gone, but his shadow stretched over every corner of the Roman world. The Ides of March became a phrase whispered through history, a warning of ambition and betrayal, of destiny and the price of power. Yet even in death, Julius Caesar achieved what he had long sought: immortality in memory, a story retold through the ages, a reminder that great men are often as feared as they are adored, and that the line between hero and tyrant is often written not in ink, but in blood.